On your screen now is Brian VanDeMark, who is a professor of history at the U.S. Naval Academy. He's the author of several books, including his most recent, American Sheikhs, Two Families, Four Generations, and the Story of America's Influence in the Middle East. Professor VanDeMark, who was Daniel Bliss?
He was the founder of what later became the American University of Beirut.
And how did he go about doing that?
With a lot of American entrepreneurial spirit. He also had the financial backing of a gentleman named William Dodge.
As in Dodge cars?
No, as in Phelps Dodge, the copper conglomerate, which made the Dodge family quite wealthy in the 19th century.
And what was Reverend Bliss's goal in founding the American University in Beirut?
I think his initial goal differed from what became his life's work. He arrived in the Middle East in the 1850s, determined to convert Muslims to Christianity, and very quickly realized that that wasn't going to happen, and that the way to make a connection with them was not to convert them, but to educate them and to improve their lives in tangible, concrete ways, because that's what they responded to positively. And once he had that insight, he ran with it and developed what later became and remains the greatest university in the Middle East. It's the Harvard of the Middle East, and it's an American institution.
Is it still open?
It is indeed. It weathered many tough years during the Lebanese Civil War from 1975 to 1991, but it remains open and stayed that way even through the tough times of the Civil War.
Who owns it? Who runs it?
It is still run by a very impressive faculty of professors and administrators who are both Middle Easterners and Americans. The current president is a direct descendant of Daniel Bliss. His name is Peter Dorman, who is an Egyptologist by training and chaired one of the important departments at the University of Chicago before he took up this job just a couple of years ago.
Is it coincidental that he's a direct descendant of Reverend Bliss, or is that on purpose?
No, I think it's a happy coincidence. The important thing to recognize is he's an extremely well-credentialed and capable scholar and administrator, but he has a personal passion for the school because of his family connection.
Again, who owns the American University, or who runs it besides the scholars?
Well, the majority of the faculty are Middle Easterners. The vast majority of students are.
Is it associated with a religion, with another school
at all?
It's
deliberately secular and non-sectarian.
And what does it cost to go there for a year?
I have no idea.
What did it cost back in Reverend Bliss's days?
I don't know the answer to that question either, but I do know that over time it began to open its doors not just to the offspring of the elite of the Middle East, regardless of religion, but to people of all ethnicities, classes, and religions, and that's its appeal, that's its merit.
How is it viewed in the Middle East currently, and how was it viewed back when Reverend Bliss opened it?
Well, I think those are two separate questions. I'll start with the chronologically earlier one first. There was a lot of suspicion on the part of the Middle Easterners when the school opened in the 1860s. This is run by Christian missionaries, Americans, who didn't have very deep roots in the region. But rather quickly, it became apparent to Middle Easterners who were not just Orthodox Christians, but Muslims and Jews, that this was the best place to get the best possible education. And within a generation, by 1900, it had become what it remains to this day, which is the Harvard of the Middle East. And what's magnificent about that is it is an all-inclusive institution founded by Americans that exists to serve the interests of the people of the Middle East, regardless of background. And it's an example of the United States giving to the region and not taking from it.
Well, speaking of which, Professor VanDeMark, do you see the AUB as being a part of American diplomacy to the Middle East?
Only indirectly. The leadership of that school has traditionally attempted to maintain its independence from the United States government, which I think is appropriate and practical. But it serves American interests in the sense that it gives Middle Easterners of whatever background and faith an awareness that the United States has a humanitarian presence in the Middle East. It's not always been about access to oil, a close relationship with Israel, or the deployment of military forces for purposes of national security. That Americans have been there for 150 years, giving to the region in much more practical and beneficial ways for the people of the region and not just for us. That's why I wrote the book. I wanted them to know that, and I wanted the American people to know that story.
Who was Malcolm Kerr and what happened to him?
Malcolm Kerr was a professor of political science at UCLA who happened to leave UCLA the year before I arrived to work on my PhD at UCLA. He had grown up in Beirut. His parents had been on the faculty at AUB. And though he had made a very distinguished career for himself in the United States as a scholar of the Middle East, he went home in the early 80s to lead the school during a period of particularly difficult times when Beirut had fractured due to the Civil War and the Israeli incursion of 1982. The city was a mess. The school was under assault. Kerr was in a lot of personal danger. But he believed that going back and running the school and providing an example of leadership at a time of crisis was the best thing to do for an institution that he loved. And he gave his life for the school. He was assassinated in January of 1984.
By whom and how?
Most likely by the fanatical wing of Hezbollah, a group known as Islamic Jihad, that comprised Lebanese Shia who had historically been underprivileged, excluded from the politics and economics of the country, had ideological affinity for the regime in Iran, brought to power in 1979, and who had been radicalized by the Israeli incursion into South Lebanon in the early 1980s. It was a very toxic mix that led them to take fanatical steps that climaxed in the assassination of Malcolm Kerr.
Why was he targeted?
Because he was an American, and not only an American, but very visible president of the greatest university in the Middle East. There was no more higher profile example of America's involvement in that region than the presidency of AUB.
Was American University put in Beirut on purpose? Was it back in the 1850s? What was Beirut like?
Beirut was and still is a very multicultural, cosmopolitan, international city where East meets West. Then and now, Muslims, Jews, and Christians all mixed and coexisted to a significant degree. And the American missionary presence in the Middle East was particularly significant in Beirut. And it became sort of the launching pad for creating what became the greatest university in the region because of this American missionary connection.
Could that university have been put in another Middle Eastern city and survived?
Perhaps, but the American presence was no greater anywhere else. And Bliss, in addition to being ambitious and visionary and practical and compassionate, was very patriotically American. He wanted to create a school that was not going to be controlled by other nationalities or other interests. He wanted to create a school that represented the American model of education, that lived American values, and that gave people in the Middle East an awareness that an American education was something that would benefit their lives every day in tangible ways. And he succeeded.
Why is it important to tell this story, in your view?
Because I think most Middle Easterners, and Americans for that matter, are unaware of this longer, deeper humanitarian dimension of America's involvement in the Middle East. When we think about our involvement in the Middle East, it usually centers on oil, Israel, and military security. And Middle Easterners feel likewise. They don't think about what are the longer roots of American involvement that have nothing to do with oil, nothing to do with Israel, nothing to do with the deployment of combat troops to protect our interests.
Brian VanDeMark, his most recent book, American Sheikhs, Two Families, 4 Generations, and the Story of America's Influence in the Middle East. This is BookTV on C-SPAN 2.